My name is Cathleen Price. This is the panel. What is the panel called? The panel's called Prisons and Capital Punishment. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Shari Silberstein. We are both, we work in the criminal justice field. I am an attorney. I represent people who have been sentenced to death. I also do other kinds of criminal defense work and civil rights work that flows from criminal justice types of issues. I've been a practicing attorney for, good God, what year is this? I've been a practicing attorney for 16 years. It's hard to say, it's hard to believe. Anyway, that's not what this panel is about. And so I bring to the panel a lot of experience in death penalty work, both the litigation context and the legal context of it. And I will let Shari introduce herself.
Great. I'm Shari Silberstein. I'm the Executive Director of Equal Justice USA, which is a Brooklyn-based national grassroots organization that does work on criminal justice issues. Our primary focus has been death penalty over the last 15 or so years. I'm sorry?
I couldn't understand. Your primary issue is what?
The death penalty as well, like Cathleen. And we work state by state with grassroots organizers around the country, kind of helping them to build campaigns in their states that work to end the death penalty. So I've been there for 12 years. Was part of the campaigns that ended the death penalty in New York here in 2005 and also New Jersey in 2007. So those were the first two states in the modern era to get rid of the death penalty. So I have a little bit of an idea of how you do that, and I'll be happy to share more of that as we get into the discussion.
Well, the panel is called Prisons and Capital Punishment. We're going to focus principally on capital punishment. Just there's not a lot of time. Prisons and Capital Punishment is a whole conference in and of itself. But I guess I want to say a little bit about why. So, we've seen an explosion in incarceration habits and practices in this country. We've gone from, 500,000 people in prison in 1972 to 2.5 million people in prison and jail today. One of the reasons for that is the expanded use of the death penalty. I'm not going to have a long historical conversation unless people want to in the context of discussion, but when Shari referred to the modern era, she's talking about from 1976 onward. We've had the death penalty in this country from its inception with one little interregnum. But what happened in 1972 was the Supreme Court considered the question of the really, really ugly arbitrariness that characterized our use of the death penalty from the inception to that point in time and halted it. And so it took, technically the Supreme Court issues these really technical rulings, and the technical ruling was the death penalty as it was being utilized at that time was unconstitutional. But they didn't say the death penalty itself is unconstitutional. And so what states did was they sort of created new statutes to create different systems that were eventually affirmed by the Supreme Court in '76. And so that is the start of the modern era. This has coincided with a lot of different cultural aspects that have worked together to generate this explosion of the death in incarceration rates. But the way the death penalty works is it's sort of how we talk about it in the field is it skews everything. When you use the death penalty for an increasing range of types of crimes, what it does is it just hangs that specter out there in ways that make life without parole seem like a reasonable sentence. It's better to get life without parole than it is to get death. It's better to get life, serve 25 years, than it is to get death. And so we're now at a place in our we're now sort of at a state of things where 1 in 11 people who are in prison are serving life sentences. And this is in part because of the expanded use of the death penalty. I think it's important for everyone, every sort of adult, every responsible adult, to be really aware of how we use the death penalty in this nation, in part because it's done in our names. And so I want to spend a little bit of time just going over the data. Some of you may already know this from your other work, but I want to move through it just so that we're all on the same page in terms of the discussion. The data. Okay, so 34 states. We have 50 states in the United States. 34 of them, that's right, 34, right? Yeah. 34 states continue to utilize the death penalty as a function of their state law. In addition to the 34 states, the federal government utilizes the death penalty in every corner of its jurisdiction. So every person in the United States lives in a death penalty jurisdiction. I represent a client who is on federal death row for a federal crime, who hails from a state that does not have the death penalty. And what I think the way to think about that, or one of the things that people should be aware of, is that the federal government has decided that it has an interest in using the death penalty in places where the local people have not chosen to reject that for themselves as a function of their local culture. This has been the subject of fairly contentious political discourse, argument, discussion, and litigation in places like Puerto Rico, where there is not only no death penalty as a function of the local jurisdiction, but it's culturally very, very offensive. But the federal government utilizes the death penalty in Puerto Rico with some frequency, relative frequency. Okay, so 34 states, federal government, as well as the military. The military uses the death penalty. Currently, we have about 3,220 prisoners who are under sentence of death. This may seem like a relatively small number, but you should bear in mind that there are dozens of thousands of prisoners who have been charged capitally and have resolved those cases with something less than death. Typically, that's life without parole. But there are there are hundreds of thousands of people who have sort of faced the specter of the death penalty in our modern era. At last count, there have been 1,283 executions in the modern era. There's been, at the same time, 140 formal exonerations. You can correct that number if you have more. Okay, 140 formal exonerations. That's about an error rate of about 1 in every 8 or 9. I myself would not get on a plane that crashed once out of every 8 flights. I would not, if my mail service failed to deliver with that kind of frequency, we'd have pandemonium and a real sort of grassroots groundswell around it. In addition to the 140 formal exonerations, there are an additional number of people about whom there are serious questions about their guilt, but they've already been executed. And I can say, as someone who has been practicing in this field and fighting against the death penalty, that no one has any resources to exonerate people that have already been executed. It's not because it doesn't have tremendous capital and value at every pivot of the movement. It's just that you can't, when you have people who are living and you have people who are gone, you have to put your resources to fight for the living. But you should not, I say that to say there are more than 140 wrongfully convicted people in the history of the modern death penalty. The majority of the death sentences emerge in the Deep South, the states that comprise the old Confederacy. Basically, it's like 80% of the death penalty it's a Southern thing. All the rest of them, I include Florida in that. Many people don't think of Florida as the South, but that's because they've only been to Miami. North Florida is absolutely South Georgia. So it's the South, and then the rest of them are in California. That's not 100% true, but that's basically true. California is a big state with a big population, and they have a pretty large death row. Let's see, the South. Oh, just coincidentally, the South, people think of the death penalty as a deterrent, and we'll talk about that, but the South also boasts having the highest murder rate in the United States, the same region. I'm going to talk a little bit later in some depth about race, but basically about half of all murder victims are white, but over 75% of executions have involved cases where the victim was white. Other just general data features, jury sentencing. Most states, as well as the federal government, utilize jury sentencing. It's unusual in that respect. In some contexts, different kinds of crimes will permit juror determination of factors that go into sentencing, but it's only in the context of the death sentence that we generally commit that decision to a jury question. We allow people facing death to receive that sentence from quote-unquote juries of their peers, or ostensibly juries of their peers. Okay, so that's the data. I want to raise 3 areas of just aspects of our death penalty that I think are important to know and understand. The first is racial bias. I don't actually think it's that controversial, even in really conservative circles, to concede that racial bias has really corrupted and infected our use of the death penalty in the United States. As I said, not only are half of all murder victims white and half are non-white. But African Americans are much more likely to be the victims of violent crime than any other community in the United States demographic. And that said, you only see the death penalty, or you overwhelmingly see the death penalty in cases where the victims are white. It's a decision that's utilized in cases where the victims are white. In Texas, which is kind of a notorious state in a lot of ways, but in Texas, I remember there literally has not been an execution in Texas of a person who had well, I should say, there's been one execution in Texas where the victim was black, and in that case there was also a white victim. And I'm kind of being roundabout about it, but my point is that probably the single most obvious place where racial bias is evident in the death penalty is in when you look at sort of the race of the victim. I'm sort of saying this in a circular way, but that's my point, is that in cases where the victim is white and the perpetrator is black, you're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if all other factors about the crime are equal. We do see statistically some disparities about race of the defendant, but it's really the race of the victim. It's the value that the system has decided about, whose lives matter, where it's reflected. What else did I want to say about race? Oh, where does this comes up? Okay, so this, I say that, and then people always want to know, like, okay, so how does it happen? Like, it's not like, there aren't a lot of people walking around sort of with kind of active, open, notorious, targeted racism. It's 2012. But this comes to fore in lots of different ways. The first place in the criminal justice system where you see racial disparities emerge is in the charging decision. As most of you probably know, the decision about how to charge a crime is a discretionary decision. It's a decision that's made by local prosecutors, who, by the way, are elected officials. They represent the community values. And I encourage everyone to be really, really attentive to what their prosecutors are doing. But setting that aside, prosecutors decide how to charge what crimes. You can charge a crime as capital murder. You can charge it as first-degree murder. If you think that there are a range of defenses, you could charge it as something less than first-degree murder. There was a long-standing joke in the capital community that a black defendant killing a white victim was capital murder. A white defendant killing a white victim was regular murder. And a black defendant killing a black victim was misdemeanor murder, where you could get off if you just agreed to pay the funeral expenses. So the charging decision. The second place where this sort of racial disparity emerges, or where it becomes active, is in jury selection. The ACLU published a report a few years ago about racial statistics in the use of the death penalty, and they found that 1 out of every 5 cases in which an execution had resulted reflected defendants who had been tried and convicted and sentenced to death by all white juries. There is an extremely trenchant and pernicious problem with underrepresentation in juries, which sort of dovetails back to what I was saying about juries make the sentencing decision in capital cases. And there's a reason for this. I mean, if we can just back up a second, it's a pretty big decision. The death penalty is the place where our government, again, in our name, says that someone deserves to be extinguished. It's making a decision about the value of a life. It's making, if you subscribe to the founding principle of this country, that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are people's inalienable rights, and that we are free people. We reside in a country with a government that is aggressively restrained from obstructing our access to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We are a government of restraint. Life is the most precious of those rights. And the government's capacity to take a life is one of its most serious and most aggressive powers, and we confine it. We attempt to confine it. We regulate it. We review it, or we're supposed to. And one of the ways we do this in the context of capital punishment is we commit that decision to jurors, that it must be a decision made by more than one person, for the most part. But the problem is we've got jurors that don't represent fair cross-sections of our community here in the United States, that don't represent people of color, that don't represent people who don't believe in the death penalty. And so racial discrimination, and I won't go in, unless people want to, I won't sort of go into the details of how you get an all-white jury, but we can talk about that if people want to sort of go into the law on that. But it is the case that time over and over again across the South, you see a complete exclusion of people of color from juries. And what this permits is a lot of sort of unspoken, well, it permits a lot of things. First of all, it's, you know, trial lawyering is a theater. I mean, it's very, very serious, but it's a theater. And I represented a client in the late 90s who had an extremely theatrical prosecution. And the prosecutor, he actually was very lucky in that his lawyer had actually developed a mental health defense. The client was very, very mentally ill. I'm not sure I've met anybody quite this floridly psychotic at the time, you know, that I met him. And he was, in other words, he was batshit crazy. He was like in the movies, which most mental illness doesn't really present like that. It really doesn't. But he really was quite ill. And he had committed a very, very horrible crime that was videotaped. And he committed the crime in his mind on orders from something that was in his head. And his lawyer actually presented this to the jury, which is relevant. The fact that he was mentally ill is relevant to the sentencing decision. Many people who are mentally ill don't manage to get that information before their juries. We'll talk about counseling in a second. I'm sorry, I'm going on for time. Okay. I'm going to go on for 5 more minutes. But Mr. Ivory. So Mr. Ivory was black, and the victim was white. And it was a young white woman who was working at the convenience store. And during his trial, at the closing argument, after his lawyer had actually put on the evidence of his mental illness, the prosecutor got up and argued that they're saying, they want you to believe he's got, you know, axis 1, schizophrenia. He doesn't have schizophrenia. What Sam Ivory has is a bad case of diggeritis. This is on the record. Now, you can't do that if you have a diverse jury. It's not effective. It's not, you know, to the extent that you think it's going to be effective, it's not going to neutralize anything in a diverse context. But you can do that if you've struck a white jury. The jury during that case deliberated for all of 4 minutes, and they came back and they sentenced Mr. Ivory to death. And so that's part of.
What year was that, and what state?
That was in Alabama in the late 90s. That was in the late 90s.
4 minutes, you said?
4 minutes, yeah. It was a very short deliberation. And Mr. Ivory eventually committed suicide. Again, he was very, very ill and not getting any assistance. But I always raise this case as because I want people to understand what it means to have all white juries, what it means for the theater that is the courtroom. Okay, so we have charging, sentencing disparities, and problems in the jury pools. The second thing, we can come back to racial bias if people have more questions, but I just wanted to cover 2 other larger themes that you want to be aware of when you think about the death penalty. The second one is poverty. As a famous anti-death penalty advocate, Brian Stevenson, often says, it's harder to get convicted. It's easier to get convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death it's easier to get convicted if you're poor and innocent than it is if you're rich and guilty. The death penalty is really about poverty here in the United States. And the reason the death penalty is about poverty is because one of the most important aspects of your capacity to fight against a death charge is counsel, is having a lawyer. And poor people in this country are entitled to lawyers, but they are provided lawyers through systems that are really, really under-resourced and undervalued. Okay, so poverty. And then the third thing that I want people to have in mind when they think about the death penalty that I think is maybe less obvious or sort of less, it doesn't come to your mind at the first one, is most of our systems are, in most of our criminal justice systems, the judges are elected. Judges are elected officials. And on some level, this seems like a good thing, right? That that communities could, through their votes, express support for a certain kind of judicial policy or another kind of judicial decision-making. But what it does in the context of criminal justice is that it focuses the political question on results. And results and justice, well, justice is part of results. Results is part of justice. But it's a much more nuanced question than I think is well served by the elective process. And so I guess it was when was Rose Bird kicked out of the California Supreme Court? Late 80s? It's in the late 80s that judicial elections became these spectacles. I mean, it's actually, there's a lot of good dissertations about judicial elections. But they became these spectacles where incumbent judges were having to defend their decisions to uphold constitutional rights on behalf of criminal defendants as though that was unjust and inappropriate in a community. And we now see, hundreds of thousands of dollars, actually millions of dollars at this point, going into judicial elections. Usually this is about situating people for civil judgments. But what the public discourse about judicial elections is always about criminal issues and the death penalty. Okay, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Shari.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the victims of crime. And the reason I really want to spend a little bit of time doing this is because there's a real kind of stereotype, I think, at least in this country, that when you're talking about crime, if you're sort of progressive or on the left, you're talking about how do you protect offenders and defendants and protect their rights and fight for fewer sentences and less sentences. And if you're on the right and you care about victims, then you're fighting for harsher sentences and more sentences and longer sentences. And this dichotomy is not only incredibly harmful, but it's also not actually true. If you look at the experience of crime victims within the criminal justice system, they, for people like me who do work against the death penalty or on sentencing reform, a lot of activists in my field feel like the victims are these very powerful and scary people who have the ability and access to power to get, harsher and harsher and harsher laws. And in fact, if you talk to the victims of crime, they feel incredibly powerless and that the system is not there for them and that they don't have a voice in the system, and that in fact they are used as pawns by lawmakers to get certain bills passed or by prosecutors to get certain convictions, but that actually most of their needs go completely unmet. And so to talk about this in a death penalty context, what does this mean for the family members, of those who are murdered? Often, very often when you do work to end the death penalty, the first thing you hear is, well, we need this for the victims. We need this for closure for the victims. Victims' families will tell you that there's no such thing as closure and that it is the most offensive word that you can use because nothing that you're going to do is ever going to bring back their loved one, and that would have been closure. Nothing else is closure. What happens is that there's, when a murder happens, it's, of course, the most traumatic event of your life. The person that you love has just been killed. You're in shock. You can hardly process the kind of trauma that you're going through. And in certain cases, with certain victims, for example, if you're a white victim, middle class or upper class, the prosecutors in that case might come to you and say, do you want the death penalty in this case? And to be confronted with that kind of question at the most traumatic moment of your life is psychologically very damaging because you get, first of all, put into sort of a crazy bind where, if you love your loved one, how can you say no? No, I don't want the death penalty. No, I don't want the harshest punishment. You sort of can't really say that. But at the same time, you can't really absorb what it means to be thinking about, what is this process that I'm about to enter? And what we've learned from meeting lots of families of murder victims who wanted the death penalty at the time that their loved one was killed is that 20 years later, they realized that they themselves have been sentenced to death because they have been going to court year after year after year to have the worst day of their lives trotted out in front of a courtroom again and again and again. And every day they've been promised, you will feel better when this execution happens. And you know what? The execution doesn't happen. They are waiting. They've put their lives on hold. They've put their healing on hold. and they're holding out for this thing, living day to day, going to the mailbox, when's the next motion, when's the next hearing, when's the next court date, when is this sentence ever going to be carried out? And the truth is that in at least 2/3 of cases, the death sentence is actually overturned at some point because of some kind of serious error. And in a lot of that 2/3, the final sentence ends up being something other than death, whether it's life or life without parole. So here you have, on the other side of that equation, these families who've been promised an execution, who've put their lives on hold for an execution, and after going through this very torturous process, they actually find out they're never going to get the execution. They actually end up with a life sentence that they could have gotten at the beginning of the process and moved on much more quickly. So that process is very, very painful for those families that do get the death penalty. Now, most families don't get the death penalty. The vast majority of murders don't end with the death sentence. In fact, a lot of murders don't ever get solved, period. There's nobody to convict, no less anybody to sentence. For those where there is, the case is solved, most of those cases don't get the death penalty. And as Kathleen said, a lot of that, there's really stark disparities around race. And if you talk to a lot of the families where there wasn't a death sentence in their case, what they'll tell you is that this concept of the worst of the worst, or you need the death penalty for the most heinous crimes, is incredibly offensive, because what it's saying to the majority of victims is there are a few murders that are heinous, and the rest of the murders are kind of normal. Your murder was not so bad. And to anybody who's lost a loved one to murder, that is the most heinous murder that there could possibly have been. So to sort of create this very visible and high-profile distinction between a few murders that are worthy of the ultimate punishment and then most that are not, sort of creates kind of this second-class, double-class status of victims, which is very psychologically damaging to the ones who don't get it, even if they don't want it. In fact, I know a number of family members who they didn't actually want the death penalty because they knew how damaging the process would be. They had maybe some personal or moral dilemmas about it. But yet when the prosecutor looked at them and said, you know what, this crime isn't bad enough for the death penalty, they felt really cheated and slighted. And that's an incredibly complicated psychological dilemma to be facing when you're also traumatized from having had your loved one murdered. The other thing that's really complicated and difficult for victims about the death penalty, and Kathleen didn't get into this, so I'm going to just share a little bit about it, is that counter to popular belief, the death penalty is actually very costly. It's much more expensive than a sentence of life without parole. And the reason is because the death penalty process itself, right from the get-go, is actually 2 trials instead of 1, and there's a much more complicated process. You have a much more involves jury selection process, which takes much, much longer. You have more pretrial motions, you have more lawyers and more experts and more investigations. The trial itself is longer. And then once you have had the trial and there's a conviction, you have to go through a whole second trial to determine if the person will get death versus life without parole, or life or some other sentence. And then you have to do that process all over again with a very complicated investigation into the defendant's background and all kinds of other things to sort of argue for or against the death penalty. And so all of those costs are borne right up front. And in most of those cases, there isn't actually a death sentence handed down. So you've now sort of gotten a life sentence, but paid for the most expensive death penalty trial you can imagine, and all those costs start getting racked up. And that's before even a single appeal is filed. You've already sort of created a much more expensive system. Now, what happens when you apply those costs to a system where only a handful of people are actually getting the death penalty? If you look at a state like Connecticut, which is where we're doing a lot of work there right now, this past year there were two very high-profile trials around Cheshire. A lot of you are nodding your heads, so you know this case, the Cheshire murder case. There were millions and millions of dollars spent over many, many years to put 2 people on death row. Hundreds of murders across the state of Connecticut either didn't get solved, didn't get a single news article written about them, didn't get, a significant sentence, didn't get a whole lot of things, and millions of dollars are going to put these 2 people on death row, and now they're going to be there for probably 20 years while the state invests a whole bunch more resources to keep fighting and chasing after this execution. So what about all of these other victims across the state that aren't getting their needs met. And victims have so many needs. They need grief counseling. They need somebody to come and wash the blood off the walls, because you know what? That is really not a fun thing to do. They need time off from work. They need compensation for wages lost to go to court hearings, or just because they can't get out of bed for days and days or weeks and weeks or months and months. They need counseling for their children who are starting to do poorly in school, or who fall into depression. They need somebody to help them navigate the court process because it's complicated and there's nobody to really tell them what to expect or what's going on. They need somebody to change the locks on the door. They need all kinds of things. And these services are very, very lacking. Most victims don't have access to them. The few that have some access to some services have to go through lots of paperwork and complicated forms and processes and rules at a time when you really don't have a whole lot of psychological resources to do that. So a lot of the families see, okay, the state has now put $6 million into putting 2 guys on death row, and most of us can't afford to bury our sons who've been killed. We can't afford a funeral. Where is the disparity in that? And so the death penalty really, when people say that it's for the victims, if you talk to the victims who've been through it, it's a completely different picture. And we've been doing a lot of work with victims' families in a lot of states. And like I said, in Connecticut, actually just the other day, there was a press conference where 179 family members of murder victims signed on to a letter calling for repeal of the death penalty. And the letter was very eloquent, and they said, some of us might support the death penalty in principle, some of us might oppose it. This is not about our philosophical positions or our personal beliefs. This is about what the death penalty is doing to all of us and how it's harmful for all of us. And similar letters have been circulated in lots of other states as well. So, if you sort of extrapolate from the death penalty to the broader criminal justice system, and I'll close this section in a second, what the death penalty really does is it's sort of symbolic of the way the whole system focuses all of its efforts on what you do to the offender. A crime happens. After the fact, we try to mop it up with some kind of symbolic act about what we do to the offender. And meanwhile, you have all of these broken people who have no help rebuilding their lives. What would it look like to have a criminal justice system in this country where the first goal was actually to prevent the crime in the first place, so you don't have the victim? Because once there's a victim and somebody to do something to, it's too late. Being tough on crime at that point, you've already missed the boat and it's too late. So, to prevent the crime in the first place, but when the crimes do happen, it's really, I think, time that we start to understand that the criminal justice system can't be just about the offender. It has to be about helping people to rebuild their lives so that the traumas that they experience don't become sort of, it's like a disease. It starts to spread through the community. And if you look at the people who commit crimes, many of them were once victims of crime. Victims of crime who got no help, who got no intervention. And at the point of victimization, had that help been there to kind of deal with that trauma, would you have been able to prevent where that person kind of went down the road? So I think at this point, we want to kind of open it up to you guys for some questions. And we actually, later on, are going to talk also about more directly the work that we do and how we do this work and what it means to do the litigation, what it means to do the organizing. But before we go into that, just in terms of this factual stuff, if folks have questions.
Okay, thanks so much for those presentations. Just a comment for each of you, I think. Kathleen, you talked about how the death penalty works as an anchor within a sort of sentencing continuum and how hard it is to do other kinds of advocacy against life without parole and so on, with the presence of the death penalty on that continuum. The other thing that strikes me is that it also absorbs so much of the sort of creative, lawyerly, activist energy in this country. And that there's only going to be so many Kathleen Prices and Brian Stevensons, and there's only going to be so many of these sort of NGOs. And as a foreigner, Canadian, I'm so struck by the amount of jurisprudence, by the amount of case law, by the number of civil rights lawyers who work on this one issue. And as Shari's presentation pointed out, to produce almost no executions. Not that that's its goal, and it fails at its goal, regardless of how, exactly. And so it's just to think about we're always fighting in civil rights to try and get lawyers to do these kinds of cases, and I think that's one of the sort of shames of the system is how many lawyers, people like Brian Stevenson should be working on something else, in my opinion. But just to add a comment or two on the victim rights discussion, I've heard so many discussions and I learned from yours, so thank you. Your talk reminded me a bit of Jonathan Simon and Christine Spalding's piece called Tokens of Esteem, where they talk about how instead of offering other kinds of social program and welfare programs, governments pass all kinds of aggravating factors that recognize certain victims groups, and that we see in those legislative materials an offering to certain kinds of demographics, where you're seeing no other offerings in government. So there's an offer of a token of esteem that we'll kill on your behalf, but we won't do other kinds of governance on your behalf. And a final point, even where, as you pointed out, the prosecutors won't always decide to capitally proceed, and that's hurtful to victims on occasion, even where they do proceed and you get to the point where victim impact statements are admitted, at that point of the trial, you're really privileging victim groups that can come forward and articulate their loss in particular kinds of ways, and those who are literate in articulating loss, or even have the sort of psychological ability to put their loss into words, is, those groups are then privileged at that stage. Kenji Yoshino has an exercise that he does with his law students at NYU, where he talks about whether emotion should be banished from law, whether the question of whether the poet should be banished from the city. And he has his students read a victim impact statement that was made by a federal judge whose father was murdered in his driveway. And it was the most powerful statement you could ever read. And each student in the class has to read a paragraph. And at the end of it, we're all so overwhelmed by the loss that this man suffered. And at the same time, you realize this is a federal judge. He knows exactly how the system works. He's an articulate man. He's had all kinds of education. Of course, he can come to court and explain the loss of his father. And there's going to be other groups that can't come forward and do that in the same kinds of ways. So, some comments there.
Yes, I just wanted to say I'm sorry I missed your presentation. But it's so timely, what you're saying, given the current past hunger strikes in Pelican Bay and throughout the California system, and the whole question about Supermax confinement and the possibility of LWOP as an alternative death penalty, which for many people is a far worse punishment than death. I wondered if
Does everybody know what LWOP means? Life without parole.
I just wondered if either of you wanted to speak to, the issue of confinement itself, in particular Supermax confinement, which again affects those who are African American or Hispanic inordinately, and the problem with what his name I'm blanking out, Stuart Grassian, who has been the psychoanalyst very often quoted in various cases about cruel and unusual punishment, has said that the entire argument about the death penalty somehow becomes egregious when one considers Supermax, indefinite solitary confinement. So I just wondered if you wanted to elaborate on that other hidden form of death penalty.
Well, I'm familiar with there are people that think of the death penalty as an execution death, whereas life without parole is a death in prison sentence. I agree. I feel like in my best self, I'm anti-prison. Like I want to honor the human in all of us by accepting that we can be better than the worst we've been, and that that Supermax is not appropriate for anybody. Supermax is a reflection on us. It's a reflection on our inability to face what is true about the range of human frailty. But I don't know where. Just to sort of bring it back down to something less abstract. I'm not sure where it's going. Supermax is also really, really expensive. I don't think it can be expanded. I don't expanded indefinitely. I think that we are going to have to learn how to cope with the people that we, about whom we've decided,
They're the worst of the worst. That's what the label makes.
Yeah, but usually you get to Supermax. It's not. It's again. It sort of. I feel like it reflects weaknesses in sort of the quality of the confinement. So you know what I mean. So it's not. It's people in Supermax are just, they may be smarter than the people, they may be sort of smart in ways that prisons view as problematic.
It's the game validation that is the really scary thing, because it's a process of labeling. And many people in Supermaxes indefinitely have been labeled as security threats.
Right.
So it's kind of inside the prison and outside, we're facing this notion of label.
Well, and I think, as Kathleen kind of said earlier, it's only in a place where the death penalty exists that the idea of locking someone up for the rest of their lives could be considered an act of mercy.
Right.
And in fact could be considered getting off easy, which is how people view life without parole as an alternative to the death penalty. That's the way that the death penalty kind of skews the whole system. As far as kind of, prison conditions and the length of sentences, it's, a lot of this comes down to the fact that, we're not offered anything else.
Right.
If you talk to people who work in corrections about what makes prisons safe, it's giving people something to do
Yep.
and helping them be productive and giving them tools to, cope and deal with the harsh life of prison and
incentivizing.
exactly.
Guards are not in support of expanded life without parole in Supermax because you have no incentive to get your shit together.
And so it's there's I think this political push that what the prison and correction system is about revenge and vengeance and punishment, and we have to make it as bad and awful as possible, and and then there's sort of what the word corrections was supposed to be about, which is about public safety. And does it keep us safer to sort of warehouse people in ways that are going to obviously make them more dangerous, because who psychologically can sort of bear that kind of living condition? But do people sort of feel like they're getting their just desserts? And so some of it comes down to what is actually the function of this system. I think the fact that it's become such a focus around it has to be as harsh as possible, and that's what justice is because we're actually just not offered any other alternative versions of justice. And, the current system that we have, this adversarial, court system, is actually, in my view, it takes us as far away from accountability as we could possibly get. Because, if you talk to victims, what they really want, they want accountability. They want somebody to say, I'm sorry. They want someone to say, I know that I harmed you. They want that accountability, but the legal system, because it's all about, do we punish this person or does this person sort of manage to get off, kind of takes the accountability question completely out of the picture altogether.
We have different ways of throwing big populations away. The Supermax is one. I'm a psychiatrist. I worked for many years with people who are mentally ill and homeless. And it's the same population of hospitals, prisons, and shelters, and the street. It's the same population, just when are they in different places. And I was asked to provide, for my program to provide psychiatric services at a variety of shelters, so I went and looked. And the most upsetting shelter that really put me to bed, under the bed for 2 weeks, was the something gay shelter on a man's name on Ward's Island. And it was so bad for me because nobody there was really mentally ill. It was clear that they just had not had an education, didn't have a job. The person who ran the cafeteria was very proud of the fact that everything was made from scratch. There were tablecloths and round tables, not long ones, so people could talk. It was clearly a very caring shelter, and for that reason, even more upsetting than the Bellevue shelter. And I realized that a whole population, a whole generation of mostly gay men was being thrown away. Was being warehoused somewhere. And so they're being warehoused here or there. And one of the places is the Supermax prisons or the other prisons. And one of the things I learned from the men who I treated was the enormity of humiliation that goes on in a prison, daily, hourly, and that's really what breaks them, is a sense of humiliation. And they have a very short fuse when they come out, so that the smallest thing that wouldn't bother any of us creates a huge thing and a big brawl because they feel humiliated over nothing at this point because they were humiliated over everything in prison all day long. And I have no answer for that. I mean, I don't know, how do you get kids education in this country if they're from a poor family in the South? You know, how do you get a whole, the next generation out of that?
Well, and I mean, I think that, the sort of growth and explosion of the prison system kind of parallels a lot of kind of loss of faith in all of these other institutions.
Yes.
So prison has become this, our education system's failing, so let's put kids in jail. Our mental health system is failing, so let's put crazy people in jail. You have all of these other institutions and systems that are supposed to solve and deal with some of these social problems, and because we don't really know how to, run them properly, prison becomes this kind of catch-all warehouse for all of those different failing institutions as kind of just the last place that you can send people and then forget about them because these other systems aren't doing what we want them to.
So Kathleen, you talked about how, the Supermax prison can't expand much further just because it's so expensive. And I know you mentioned Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and how she makes a comment in her introduction, I think, that the war on drugs isn't sustainable for much longer because it's so expensive. But that doesn't really get to the issue of, it still leaves us with the ideological problem of what we do, of how we think we should just lock up a significant portion of our population. And as we are getting to these more economic constraints on the prison system, that may lead people, us not putting in people in Supermax facilities, not locking people up as long for different drug offenses. How do we still tackle that ideological problem that, if we could, we would?
It's a big problem. I mean, I guess, the ideological problem, I feel like, that could just sort of pass. Let's just sort of talk about the drug issue. I mean, I think that there is growing interest in more front-end responses to the kind of drug problems that, for the last 30 years, have landed people in prison sentence. This is sort of a back-end response to a drug problem. Many people who are in prison for drug use, possession, and sale, it's people that you could think of as having a health problem, if you were inclined. Since it's become efficient, tactical to deal with it as a health problem, hopefully, I'm just sort of spinning out a possibility, right? I feel like hopefully the investment of resources may produce results, right? It may produce results that become part of the popular discourse about the scourge of drugs. I mean, it's also true that, drugs in particular, I feel like it's so time and place, culturally specific. That is changing. It is true that the people that initiated the war on drugs we really do feel differently about drugs now. I mean, it's just. So that's sort of I think the ideological problem hopefully will flow from seeing some results. I mean, in the context of, old people who we think of as ultra-violent people, we may commit more resources to understanding how to work with that differently, because we know that we can't work with it with endless, ever-increasing, more severe confinement. And not just because it's expensive and it doesn't work, but it actually, I thought of this when you were talking, Shari, it does something to the people that have to implement that. And we don't talk about that at all in the way we talk about our criminal justice system. It is debilitating and degrading to a human being to put another person in a Supermax cage, to hold another person to the sort of isolation that supposedly requires that he not have any human contact. Servicing a human being without talking to them is bad for me. You know what I'm saying? It's damaging to me. So we're going to see consequences from this that are I think going to be become part of the conversation about, is this really what we want to be doing?
Well, and some of the, I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, some of the voices, I'll be fast, I promise, that have really come out about the death penalty in recent years have been the wardens who've carried out the executions. And, you meet some of these guys and you learn about how many of the executioners have committed suicide or had nervous breakdowns or become
I've
alcoholics.
seen them be in tears at the execution.
Yes,
They've
I
known
mean-
these dudes for 30 years.
Exactly. I mean, there's a man from Florida, Ron McAndrew, he was a warden and carried out 8 executions, and you listen to him talk about how he goes to sleep at night and he sees the men that he executed sitting at the foot of his bed every night while he goes to sleep, and he's haunted by them. And I mean, to ask people who have had no say in handing down the death penalty or in making these laws to subject their whole lives to that kind of an experience is actually really offensive.
And it's dehumanizing. I mean, it's damaging.
I think these things are very important, but I think we really have to get back to what this mean. What does this mean to a society that considers themselves made up of human beings?
Yeah.
To treat other human beings in this absolutely barbaric way. I'm talking about the kinds of things that Kathleen was talking about, the torture. What are the conditions in Supermax? Do people really know what it's like to have solitary confinement, sense deprivation, not to see your relative? The kinds of things that the prisoners, some of the so-called, in quotes, worst of the worst at Pelican Bay, Supermax, went on hunger strike about, and some of them I think are still on hunger strike. And one of the prisoners just died, I believe. I'm not sure.
Calpatria.
What?
Not at Calpatria.
Yeah, Calpatria. People, I do not, but this connects to the last question in the plenary session. When someone said, what do we do to help people get over the fear that they demanded? Well, I don't see a lot of people out there really calling for more Supermaxes. They tolerate it. They think that there is the worst of the worst that have to be put away. But I think a big thing is getting out what is actually happening using Michelle Alexander's book, using Colin Diane's book, and building resistance. Building resistance, saying, no, we have to stop this new Jim Crow. We have to stop mass incarceration. We're in a book that says stop, stop, and frisk. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of absolutely innocent young black Latino men in New York up against the wall. What does that do to the human spirit when they're put up against the wall, whether or not they're put into jail, and the vast majority of them no crimes at all? Do people know about this? I'm talking about people in New York, but people in other places too, because it's been a great example of New York policing. These are the things that I think people have to be really imbued with. What it says, when what has been defined as torture, and what we know as humanity, as being a human being, is torture, is conducted in our name.
I think you raise a, yes.
And this has to be, I just get infuriated.
Well, but I think you raise a good point that there is a lot of public ignorance about the truth, about the reality. When you educate people about how the death penalty operates, a lot more people are against it. You know what I mean? Even if you're for it in principle, nobody really thinks that you should get the death penalty because of the race of the victim. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's just not, it's irrational. It's just fundamental, it's irrational. And so when you educate people about how it works, it does actually create activism and resistance and education. So I definitely, I appreciate that we're at a moment of, much more aggressive public education around mass incarceration issues.
Yeah, thank you. My view is that aren't there a large prison population and the very disproportionate amount of people of color is all very deliberate. That it is completely deliberate.
Yes.
And the easy answer, to give you two-word answer, government contracts. Government contracts gets given out to the uniform people, the billy club people, the gun people, the wall people, etc.
Look, it's the new factory, yeah.
And I also know that a very high percentage of people in prison are there for drug-related crimes. In this country, we essentially have no drug treatment. We pretend we do, but basically we have an 80-year-old method, a program that's a spiritual, psychological, maybe to complement it, that has a 23% success rate. 23% success rate is not a success rate. And I personally believe the reason that this biochemical disease is not treated biochemically is because addicts we're a feeder population for the prisons.
Well, I also think, I mean, just with respect to I think there are a large number of the people who are in prison for drug crimes do suffer from clinical addiction, but it's also true that you don't have to be an addict to get picked up on a drug charge. I mean, and it's sort of, treatment actually isn't appropriate for recreational drug users. And there just are huge, it just isn't, and this is, we don't have a solution for that, but there are plenty of people that they don't really qualify for clinical addiction.
Yeah, that's very true.
I mean, most drug offenders, let me just get this statistic out. Most drug offenders had jobs in the month before their conviction, the month before their arrest. And so when you arrest them and confine them to interrupt their drug behavior, you also interrupt all their other behavior. So let's say they were being a dad, or if you've ever, Shari and I both have worked in small organizations, and one of your staff members can't come to work for 2 weeks. The person was probably productive. It's
And paid taxes.
Yes,
And
paid
now
taxes.
costing taxes.
And now
This
paid.
is what you're saying.
Yes.
This is a deliberateness to recycle certain groups of this population in this country, as has been the case throughout its history, receptacles for certain types of people. And it's connected to the idea of why supermaxes will not, in my opinion, and that is because so much money has been invested in them already, and they are, especially when taken over by private prisons, extreme money makers. These people who invest in stocks in the private prison industry are breaking it in. As they say, these are recession-proof stocks. And I have seen...
That goes back to the woman's point back there about what is this happening in our culture that you want to make your money this way?
You want to
But
you also want to lock up certain groups who might have resistance in them, might have really possibilities of transforming the public conversation. Who are those people? And since I was around in college in the 70s and was very familiar with the community activism of African Americans, in particular the Black Panthers, I know that this is a deliberate, concerted effort to transform the face of this country into a place for the disposables to go. And the labeling of worst of the worst, now with the National Defense Authorization Act, it's going to work in even larger ways. And I think there will be an inventive darkening of the population so that those who are not necessarily African American are going to be tarred with the same brush, because all you have to do, whether it's the Military Commission Act or the NDA, it's simply, are you a threat? And numerous people of all different groups and all different colors are being targeted. And I do think it's important to know that the Supermax, whether it's in Haiti, the first prisons that were being built, nothing has happened, as we all know, in reconstruction in Haiti. The IDP camps are large and they are not changing. But the first contract was for Wagner Corrections, a private prison which has changed its name, the GEO Group it's called, and they are building Supermax prisons in the countryside of Haiti. So I do think it's a global phenomenon about
American prisoners going to be put there?
not American, Haitians. Haitian people, Haitians who happen to be dispossessed in camps and are considered threats. I mean, I do think there is a very, very large way in which the Supermax will serve a lot of purposes, because it doesn't only lock down, but it also transforms, as you were saying, without any education, it brutalizes, and it then confirms the so-called worst of the worst label.
No, if whatever you go into Supermax, you come out worse.
This is a bit like Zygmunt Bauman's argument about the modern day supermax as a factory of exclusion, whereas solitary confinement in early American use was a factory of discipline to inure workers to the industrial age, whereas now it's to exclude the waste of globalization.
Right. It's a zone of exclusion and banishment.
If I could just finish my point, what I was saying was that a biochemical disease, a hereditary biochemical disease, needs to be treated biochemically. And somehow there's a complete blind spot, and I think it's deliberate, because we can put people in jail, and that benefits the higher ups of the system.
And even you're saying there isn't we don't have a lot of good treatment paradigms generally for drug problems, but the ones that are actually available are also really poorly implemented. I mean, there are plenty of people who 12-step is just not going to work. They're not.
No. It's very hard to speak against it in a Christian country.
Yes, it is. Or in a southern prison. Like, you want to some drug treatment, but you are not a practicing Baptist. Were there questions over there? I don't remember.
Do you want to move on?
Yeah.
So we don't have a whole lot of time left, but we did want to share a little bit just about what we do. Now that we've gotten all the bad news out, what can we do about it?
The trends are with us.
The trends are with us.
The trends are with us.
So I just want to share a little bit about the kind of work my organization does and some of the kind of hopeful signs that we're seeing, at least in terms of the death penalty and where things are going. So like I said earlier, we're a national grassroots organization that works state by state to end the death penalty. And what we do is we partner up with local organizations on the ground in each state to kind of help them build grassroots campaigns to repeal the death penalty. And ultimately that generally means legislation at some point in the process. Sorry, I just hit the microphone. And these grassroots campaigns involve kind of all of the different elements that you would think go into any effort to pass a piece of legislation. It includes lobbying and influencing of lawmakers. It includes grassroots organizing and public education. It includes media and communications to kind of frame the issues. And because all of this information about the things that Kathleen shared and the seemingly endless stream of innocent people who've walked off of death rows in the last many years and some of the other flaws that people are seeing, there's been kind of a reawakening about the death penalty and people really reconsidering their positions. And so just to share a little bit about what some of that momentum looks like, from 1976 until 1995, the only trend was that states were bringing back the death penalty. The most recent state to do so was New York in 1995. And then the first state to get rid of it was New York in 2005. And it was sort of the shortest death penalty experiment that we've had. But that sort of started a trend. And since then, New Jersey has ended the death penalty. And New Mexico has ended the death penalty. And Illinois has ended the death penalty. And Illinois is actually very important because in 2000, after a number of innocent people were found on death row in Illinois, the governor suspended executions there. A pro-death penalty Republican governor suspended executions and put together a commission to say, how can we prevent the execution of an innocent person and fix the death penalty? And that commission.
He's in jail.
Now he's in jail. Not for anything related to the death penalty.
I don't know about that.
Well, officially, it is Illinois after all. But that commission spent 3 years looking at the death penalty and trying to figure out how can we make this a system that works. And what they came up with was 85 different reforms. They said there are 85 changes that we need to make to this system. And even if all 85 of them are implemented, you will still not have a death penalty that doesn't make mistakes. So the Illinois legislature looked at those reforms. They put some of them in place, but not most of them. And then they set up another commission to look at whether the reforms worked. And that commission spent another 7 years studying the death penalty and studying the reforms. And so what's important about that is you basically have 10 years of a moratorium on executions, 10 years of experts studying the death penalty with deliberate intention to make it better, slews of reforms implemented, and at the end of those 10 years, everybody threw their hands up and said, you know what? It can't be done. We're cutting our losses and we're walking away. And that was actually a year ago in a week and a half will be the 1 year anniversary of the end of the death penalty in Illinois. So if anything kind of sends a message out to other states that are sort of looking at this and struggling and saying, can we make the system work better? I think the Illinois experience is that no, even when you try harder than anybody, no, you can't. In the meantime, there are a lot of other states that have gotten very, very close. In Connecticut a few years ago, the legislature did vote to abolish the death penalty, although the governor vetoed the bill. It was both houses passed passed legislation to end the death penalty. In Montana, a Republican-controlled Senate twice in a row has voted to repeal the death penalty. In Colorado, they've come within only one vote of ending the death penalty and actually using the savings from ending the death penalty to open up a cold case unit that would start to investigate unsolved murders. And that was backed by a very strong coalition of victims, families in unsolved murders who said, you know what, we're not against the death penalty in theory, but if we had to choose between like two people sitting on death row and never getting executed, or like solving our loved ones' cases, like hello, it's not really a choice. New Hampshire, the House of Representatives voted to end the death penalty. In Kansas, they came within one vote of ending in the Senate to end the death penalty. California has actually just submitted 800,000 signatures to put the death penalty on the ballot this November, to put the vote to the people of California. In North Carolina, they passed a very groundbreaking reform called the Racial Justice Act, which now gives people the opportunity to challenge their death sentence on the basis of statistical evidence of racial bias, which has never happened. You have, I spoke a lot about the victims' family members, but there are a lot of other voices like members of law enforcement who you typically think of as pro-death penalty, kind of standing up and saying, this is a diversion, it is a waste of my resources. There's a prosecutor that we work with in Maryland who, my favorite quote, he says, the death penalty sucks all the air out of the room. Like, it just sort of takes this whole criminal justice system and it makes it about this one thing. And, like, I can't do my job. There was another prosecutor in New Mexico who said that for the amount of time and prosecutors that I put on one death penalty case, I could close 400 other murder cases. 400 other cases. So you have these kind of new voices coming out. And a lot of this has to do with the activism of people like us and like you, sort of not just sitting in a classroom or a conference or watching a documentary, but then actually getting up and doing something about it. And it's really important. I just want to kind of encourage all of you to not think of your activism as ending here in this room today. But it's really important when you hear something or learn something or you see a great movie or whatever, that you tell other people who don't already think like you do. Because it's very easy to, for all of us who already think this way, to find lots of other people who also think this way, and we can kind of goad each other on. But we need to tell people who don't already think this way and kind of make sure that they understand it. So share the movie, write your blog posts, tell your friends, but also communicate to people in power. Tell people who make decisions, communicate to your lawmakers. When you sign a Move On petition, if it's something you care about, don't just hit send. Pick up the phone and also call the legislator who's going to be taking the vote, because that call is really different from the petition, even though it's just way easier to sign it online and be done with it. And then make sure 10 of your friends call. And then make sure that you get involved with an organization that is also finding 10 more friends and 10 more friends and 10 more friends. Institutions and nonprofits and activist movements thrive on kind of building these communities together. And we, I can say as a nonprofit, we need people like you to bring us resources and your time and your money and your bodies and your friends, and to build our networks, because it's only together when we sort of do all of these actions, these individual actions, every one of these phone calls makes a difference. And I know, because I do run these campaigns, we hear very, very often from lawmakers who will actually say, I got 200 calls this weekend about ending the death penalty. I'm actually really going to think about this, and it does have an impact. And I think sometimes when you're thinking about big national or international policies, it feels like these calls don't matter. But when you're talking about state and local politics, they make a huge difference. And I can tell you that your vote for president does not matter that much compared to your vote for, as Cathleen said, your local prosecutor or your city council members, because this is where the laws are being made that actually impact your lives and kind of change these policies. So I know we're kind of short on time, so I'm just going to kind of stop there, and if you want to talk about the lawyer side.
Well, that's really great. I'm going to just talk a little bit. I'm a straight-ahead lawyer, all the bad things you think about lawyers. I am that person. It's funny. I feel like there's a whole nother dialogue to be had about what you were talking about the just the sort of working together and the problems with what is adversarial in our system. And I'm the big adversary, right? My approach to reform around criminal justice and the death penalty as an attorney has been to fight and be really ugly and adversarial on behalf of individual clients. I like a lot of people, I went to law school because I think I went to law school because I thought I wanted to be a professor, and the law professors made more money. I think that's why I went to law school. But it didn't work out that way. I ended up immediately going into anti-death penalty work, and I've been reflecting on your comment about how the creative lawyering is in the death penalty and it siphons the energy off. There's so many needs around the death penalty. We have so few lawyers who are willing to represent clients. I continue to feel like, no, we need more lawyers to represent clients. And there's a real tension there. I think there's a tension between representing individual clients, because the truth is that when you sort of descend to the particular in all of these cases, it's hideous. The narratives are hideous. The truth about what reduces people to engaging in really aggressively violent, bad behavior is hard to bear. And one of the things that I think I do as an individual lawyer in direct service is try to walk that road with the person who's trying to walk it with himself. And so what I guess I want to leave you with, dovetailing on what Shari said, is that when you read about a crime and you read about an act of violence, accept that the person may really be guilty. He may have done it. We didn't have people talking on the public safety side in sort of this discourse, but I was hoping that people would jump in. But it's an issue for us. The question is how we confront that issue as a community, how we confront that issue as a function of our social contract and with our notions of what is just. But I hope everyone leaves here mindful of the fact that the person may have done it, but it's also true that there's a whole story there. There's usually one side of the story that's told in the context of the media and in the context of the prosecutor. And that's why we do have such aggressive adversaries, or why we hope for zealous adversarial system, is to get the other side of that narrative out. We didn't talk about parole. I mean, there just is so much to talk about. I mean, I think that the parole discourse is mimicking all of this, all of the excessively punitive style.
And
It's stylish to be excessively punitive.
In them, a generation is being punished. They're those sacrificial lambs. I believe.
Well, the
This-
concept
this
of parole is about who you are at the moment of parole. That's the notion. And to deny people parole on the basis of what was true 30 years ago suggests that the initial sentence was incorrect. The sentencing judge said at some point, you may be ready for parole. But what we're seeing is that parole boards here and everywhere are refusing it around politics, around a narrative that just isn't actually rationally related
You
to our.
have to think if you're going to give someone parole. And I don't think these people actually can think. It's just,
Well, they do
to
think.
hammer everything's a nail. So for them, they have to think a lot to think that this person it's justified in giving them parole. They have to think about that, and I don't think they can. I don't think they're taught to. I don't think they have the skills to think in that kind of a way.
One of the grades on recidivism, well, they're very, very high.
Yes.
Right? So,
They go down a lot when you educate people in prison and give them opportunities to do things other than sit around and make trouble.
But that's the other dovetail. The other point is that we release people we give them the chance to do better without giving them the tools. And people didn't get into prison because they came from well-adjusted backgrounds with, just isn't, and prison isn't a great place to grow up and get better at anger management. It's just.
Plus, lifers have the lowest rates of recidivism, and they're the people who are in on a life sentence. It
So they've
seems to be
served
that with a life sentence, with a murder, oftentimes you didn't come from a pattern of criminality, but that you had a personal, this is typically the fact of the crime, and so these are the category that have the lowest rates of recidivism.
Lifers also get out when they're 55 years old, which is just, it's not a high crime. It's not a high crime age.
But even there, especially in the California system, parole still denied, even when the risk assessment is so low. Yeah.
Just one brief thing here. For people who think that people in prison are really, just can't be rehabilitated or something, I work with a group called the Prisoners Revolutionary Literature Fund. And it responds to requests from prisoners for revolutionary literature, principally revolution newspaper, and some of the works from Monovakian. And we get amazing letters from prisoners. They're dealing with the question of the oppression of women for the first time. And they're realizing some of the heinous things that they did. They're trying to set up discussion groups, and some of them are succeeding. And they're countering some of the fundamentalist religious groups that get into prison, as well as some of the racist groups. And there was an effort to ban the revolutionary literature from prisons, in California, and there was a big battle around this. Because when people begin to look at the world and themselves in it, with, I would say, a perspective of what created these problems that they responded to, and some of them in not very good ways, but they begin to see themselves in the world in different ways, and they begin to see themselves as playing a very positive role, even though they continue to be locked up behind bars. We saw it in Attica, those people who were of that age, with the Attica rebellion that happened here. The prisoners who came together, who formed collective ways of dealing with things, who developed very sophisticated demands and approaches to things, and they were slaughtered by Governor Rockefeller and things. But we've seen it. And so this is what, people say they can know. Absolutely. But first of all, we have to take responsibility for stopping this system that has, criminalized a whole section of people here. And they are people who I think the system, as I think Colin Diane said, represent a potentially very disruptive, radical, and revolutionary element in society as a whole. So this is one way. They've said it themselves. Richard Nixon told Haldeman, well, the problem is the blacks, only we have to solve this problem in a way that doesn't come out and say it. And they developed the war on drugs. So, and that's in some of these books. So.
Thank you.
Thank you all.